Thanks again, Caroline, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak to the seminar. I'm very glad that you all are here, spending a little bit of your early evening with me. Back in the days when these things used to happen in person, I had gone to a lecture. There was an argument for the importance of climate change as a historical force in global history. And one of the primary cases was the fall of the Roman Empire. The speaker had suggested that the Western Empire wouldn't have ended when it did, were it not for the agrarian changes that were precipitated by the cooling of the climate and an uptick in rainfall. And the lecturer wasn't an expert in antiquity or the Middle Ages, so I didn't want to dig into the details about the critiques that have been made of such an argument, but I also did want to dig into the details. So I asked a more basic question about the way that we do big history. I just wanted to know, how would the global view change that he was presenting if important elements of a specific case turned out to be contested or even disproven? And the question definitely can be mistaken for seeming territorial, because historians have a track record of finding fault in big picture narratives that try to distill centuries and continents worth of developments into a book or a 45-minute talk. But historians also have a track record of liking and learning from big picture narratives that somehow do capture something significant about wide stretches of time and space. And thinking about scale, thinking about how the small relates to the large, is a very medieval move. In particular, when thinking about big history, smallness mattered very much. And in my talk today, I'd like to show how and why the integration of both big and small perspectives mattered to the early medieval West, and why they might matter to us too. So I'll start on the small end with something that might not seem worthy of our attention at all, which, as you can obviously guess, is the pig. And pigs may seem like a small subject, but they were vitally important in the early Middle Ages, not only because they were ubiquitous, but also because they shaped the dynamics of bigger seeming issues. They had particular attributes and behaviors and relationships to their environments that made them powerful participants among human communities. And a striking aspect of pig history is that it challenges our sense of causation and scale. This relatively small animal made a big difference, and early medieval humans thought so too. But one might forgive their neglect because, from a human perspective, pigs are usually destined to be dead. They were the only livestock in antiquity in the Middle Ages that were raised exclusively for their meat. Other animals could be raised for what are called secondary products, although that's something of a misnomer because often these secondary products are the primary reason for raising those animals in the first place. So cattle provide pulling power and also dairy. Sheep and goats provide wool and dairy. Poultry provide eggs. Pigs weren't even all that good for parchment, actually, unlike sheep and goats and calves. And so pigs were rarely the most prominent livestock on farms, which meant that they weren't often the most commonly eaten meat. Many medieval communities ate more beef by weight than pork, or raised more individual sheep and goats than pigs. To give a very general overview, here's what we can tell from the animal bones that have survived after early medieval eaters and butchers threw away their trash. The osteoarchaeological record suggests that in Ireland, cattle were the predominant livestock. Deeper in the north, the Scandinavian settlements on Iceland raised cattle and sheep especially, but their diet was often dominated by fish. Greenlanders didn't really raise pigs, presumably because they didn't think it was worth penning them up for 9 months out of the year, because it was too cold to pasture livestock in Greenland except in summer. Instead, their main meats were walrus and seal. Further south, England toggled between cattle and sheep, Central Europe between cattle and pigs, and Gaul between all three kinds of domesticates. The Italian peninsula favored pig until the 11th century or so, then flipped its emphasis to sheep and goats. And then in Iberia, the Maghreb, Libya, Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Greek mainland, all of them concentrated on ovicaprids. These are obviously very rough generalizations, which is why emojis are appropriate here. But on the ground, the balance of livestock also varied a lot, depending on what a community's microecology was like, and also on what its trade networks and economic plans involved, and even on what the status and preference of its residents were. And thanks to advances in settlement archaeology and bioarchaeology over the past few decades, it's increasingly possible to reconstruct the environmental and economic profiles of individual farms. The early medieval countryside is increasingly visible to us. What we're now able to see complicates this big picture. Just to start with a simple example, because pigs love acorns and people did not, pigs were often fattened in the woods in fall to take advantage of an otherwise unexpected or unexploited crop. But the presence of woods didn't automatically mean lots of pigs. And on the flip side, having lots of pigs doesn't always signal that a community had access to extensive woodland. So, for example, in the high plains of the Tunisian Tell, which were intensively farmed in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, pork consumption was noticeably high, even without substantial woodlands close by. So at the small town of Altoburos during its Vandal phase, which was roughly the 430s to the 530s, pigs comprised about 30% of the total animal remains, even though the paleobotanical evidence points to widespread land clearance and erosion in the same century. So in other words, although the residents of Altoburos were cutting down a lot of woodland for olive production in the Vandal period, they were still raising almost as many pigs as their predecessors had done when there were more woods around. We can find a contrasting example at the village of Zubaia, right at the edge of the foothills of the Cantabrian Mountains in northwest Iberia. The residents of Zubaia had access to woodlands of cypress, pine, oak, and beech, but the villagers here concentrated on raising sheep and goats for wool and meat. So for every pig, there were more than 2 ovicaprids. Then there is Lerina, which was an elite estate in central Gaul sitting on a plateau overlooking a wide plain. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit further here to get a sense of the settlement. You can see that this area is uninhabited now. This is just a Google view. At Lerina, pig consumption moved in an inverse relationship to the presence of woodland. So in the Roman period, when the villa's inhabitants cleared wooded spaces to grow walnut and chestnut trees, the pig population peaked at 40% of the site's animals. But as oak, pine, and spruce rebounded in the early Middle Ages, the proportion of pigs relative to other livestock actually decreased. It dropped 32% in the 6th century and 22% in the 7th. What I'm trying to say through these examples is that woods and pigs were part of complex ecological systems in which any given farming practice was the product of interlocking variables, not in linear relationship between 2 quotas. So I want to take you deeper into 2 case studies to give you a sense of those systems in action. And the first case involves a village in Gaul called Devlier-Courtetel. And this settlement sat on the banks of the river Pran on the Jura Plateau. Today the river is straight, but in the early Middle Ages it was curvy and full. And it often overflowed its banks between roughly 650 and 850 because this was a wet time in southeastern Gaul. And as a result, the village was surrounded by secondary watercourses and marshes and floodplains. But the residents were evidently undeterred by all the water because they built their houses only 5 to 10 meters from the riverbank on top of a clay and limestone surface that was naturally water resistant. They also built a series of pools that and bank reinforcements that they used to take advantage of for their textile workshops and for an extensive metallurgical operation. And when the settlement was founded in the second half of the 6th century, the marshes were initially forested with white fir, beech, oaks, alder, and ash, and they were surrounded by lower density woods or savannas that were good for pasturing livestock. But that changes over the next century and a half, when significant portions of those woods were gradually cleared in order to feed the iron furnaces, to cultivate more cereals and textile fibers, and to provide more prairie land for cattle, whose meat seems to have been pretty skillfully butchered and then exported somewhere else. Grazing also had the effect of changing the composition of the woodland because the cattle were feasting on fir saplings, which encouraged the growth of beeches and oaks that would otherwise compete with fir. So in this mix, pigs would have fit in really well if there had been more of them even. They'd have loved the beechy and oaky woods, but they weren't an export industry at Devlier-Courtetel. They were mostly just eaten by the people who lived here. Instead, it was cattle husbandry that had a major impact on the landscape because villagers saw beef production as especially compatible with other elements of their environment and economy. Forest clearance generated fuels for industries that were built on that swollen river, and the resulting grasslands and savannas were good for cows. Pigs fit into W.A. Courtatel's ecology, but their lives and roles in this wet, woody space would have been distinct from the lives of pigs elsewhere. So the second example I want to discuss at more length is in Italy at a very different kind of site, Faragola. Faragola is an example of how ecologies changed over time and how pig husbandry was enmeshed in those trajectories too. Faragola is in northern Apulia. It sits in the valley of the Carapelle at the juncture of several ecosystems. So there's the valley corridor. It's also linked to the Tavoliere Plain, the foothills of Monte Dauni, the promontory of Gargano, and the high plain of Morgia. And in the Roman Empire, both the state and prominent senatorial families had heavily invested in this area. And that resulted in an excellent road infrastructure and thriving towns to the north and south with many villa complexes. Faragola itself had begun as a villa in the 2nd or 3rd century, and in the 4th, the residents even scaled up. They built a bath complex and an opulent summer dining room, replete with a carved stone dining couch. This is a reconstruction, as well as opus sectile rugs that were probably imported from Egypt, and floors covered in polychrome marbles. During this late antique phase, when the villa was an elite residence and also an expansive agricultural complex, the occupants weren't particularly invested in raising sheep and goats, even though this region, northern Apulia, was the center of transhuman pastoralism. But at Faragola, pigs were by far the most prominent livestock in the 4th and 5th centuries, and they constituted over 70% of the livestock remains found here. The villa was continuously occupied into the 6th century, but by 600 or so, there had been dramatic changes to the structure and the function of the property. And most strikingly, the cenotio was turned into an artisanal area where animals were stalled and grain was stored, and there were metallurgy and ceramics operations on site. We also know that at this time, Faragola was surrounded by woodland that was dominated by deciduous oaks and mastic, and both of those species were perfect for the metal and ceramic work that was happening here, especially in terms of fuel, because oak burns hot and long and mastic is good for kindling. But the site as a whole in this phase doesn't seem to have housed any residents. Instead, by the 7th century, it's functioning as a productive center, not only for the furnace, but also for field agriculture and bone working and sheep and goat husbandry. And whoever was here or working at Faragola in the period, they were at least eating their lunches here. And the meat they ate came mostly from their flocks, along with lots of chicken, some fish from the nearby river, a little bit of pork, and occasionally beef from old draft animals. But things changed again in the 8th century. Now there were residents living here in huts that were built inside the residential rooms of the former villa. And they're raising more pigs than the farmers before them had done. In this period, ovocaprid and pig remains are equally represented, but it seems that they were exporting the best cuts of pork off-site because it's the bones from pigs' heads and feet that overwhelmingly dominate the remains. There's also much less agricultural work happening here, and the amount of oak on site also drops, which could either mean that the woodland had been substantially reduced compared to the previous century, or it might just mean that the community had cut back on its timber usage for the sake of the oak's acorn crop in order to fatten the pig herds in the fall. Regardless of what happened to the woodland, the big picture is that this single site had had its relationship to the landscape recalibrated several times over. And this handful of examples give a sense of why it's difficult to generalize when it comes to environmental and agricultural history. It also constitutes evidence for the ways that pigs were part of a multivariable and changing ecological landscape. But it is still possible to say more sweepingly that despite the fact that pigs weren't always the most popular livestock in most places, there were still always pigs almost everywhere you went. So to put this in more human terms or in a human scale, almost every household would have raised pigs throughout the year, even in regions where pork consumption was generally very low. And I'll give just one quick example, which is the Visigothic village of Gosques. This is about 20 miles southeast of Madrid. Pig bones here comprise about 2 to 7% of all the mammal bones that were recovered from site. And that range is really typical for rural settlements in the lowlands of the Spanish central system. But this community still, it was probably about 80 to 100 residents. They were still eating a quantity of pig bones that suggests that each family in Ghost Cliffs was eating 1 to 2 pigs per year. And based on the stable isotope signatures of those pig bones, we know that the pigs of Ghost Case were free-ranging animals. That was typical also of early medieval pig husbandry. At Ghost Case, they probably were foraging in the fields and grasslands surrounding the village because there's no sign of woodlands in the pollen data. Pigs were flexible like that. They were, and they still are, astoundingly omnivorous eaters. That might mean eating whatever their caretakers brought them, whether it was oats in the Rhineland or fish guts and bones in Iceland. It might mean scavenging for things they weren't supposed to eat, like grapes on the vine, or sometimes human corpses. But pigs seem to have been happiest when they were rooting, not only for roots, but for other subterranean things they loved, like grubs and worms. Isidore had suggested that this was the very essence of pigginess. Rooting is what gave the pig its name. Around 80% of a pig's weight consisted of flesh and fat. Most domesticated pigs tended to be smaller and leaner than the breeds we know best today, but just one of these early medieval animals could still have yielded around 100 to 175 pounds of meat and lard after it was killed. This was enormously valuable work. Thanks to their versatile bodies and curious natures, pigs made conversions of matter that humans otherwise didn't want into pork they prized. They had the ability to navigate the highly specific and localized ecologies of woods and grasslands and to link them to the fortunes of the farm. For this reason, pigs were often treated as pioneers of undeveloped spaces. Roman soldiers had relied heavily on pig husbandry when they were first setting up colonial outposts. And as the osteological record suggests, some villages in Anglo-Saxon England would often eat more pigs in their early days when they were setting up than they would as more mature settlements. And there's also indications in the Polyptychs that monasteries would start pig farms on new properties that they'd acquired while they made longer-term decisions about the agrarian regimes they wanted to implement on those pieces of land. And they did this because pigs' work of fattening offered a rapid and reliable metabolic process of landscape development when food was otherwise difficult to get. But as even this image suggests, pigs were not always compliant co-workers. And I should point out in some of the images going forward, I'm not always going to give you an exegesis or explanation of what you're looking at. Normally I would intersperse blank slides in a talk in person, but on Zoom I've found that people prefer to look at something rather than just a black screen while a disembodied voice talks at them. But if you have any questions about these images, I'm happy to answer them. Anyway, back to the problems that pigs caused. Their best assets, as far as humans were concerned, were their intelligence and their dietary ingenuity. But those were also the exact same things that made them a liability, because pigs liked to escape and they were very clever about figuring out how to do it. No matter what kind of fencing or boundary system that farmers devised to pen them in, pigs found a way to get free. And we know based on modern mammal research that pigs are still good at solving their way out of spatial puzzles. They can jump up to 4 feet high. They can swim a few miles at a time. But that's not just something we find out from modern research. It's also crops up in the evidence from pigs living 1,500 years ago. And because pigs are a highly social species, they learn from each other. All it took was one smart pig to teach the others how to get loose. Piglets were known to jump their fences multiple times a day, and they were known to lead the rest of the herd each time. The problem was deciding how much to fine their owner. A few frustrated farmers even tried to tether their pigs by the hind leg in an attempt to anchor them to a spot in the farmyard. The pigs would try so energetically to free themselves that some of them broke their legs in the process, and that struggle shows up in their bones. And once pigs were loose, they would root. In the right contexts, this made pigs valuable. In the wrong contexts, it made them enormously destructive. Once pigs escaped their pens, they were capable of what the old Irish laws called root trespass, which was classed as even worse than the kinds of damages that other livestock were capable of, because pigs could eviscerate a field of crops rather than just trim it down. They could re-engineer a landscape by digging ditches so that a carefully plowed field or flat meadow would become transformed in an afternoon into a totally different terrain. This would have been a risk in cities too, because as Caroline's work shows, many towns in the early Middle Ages were filled with extensive food gardens. But pigs that escaped could go beyond rooting. Sometimes they bit people. They could kill adult men and women, not to mention children. They were known to defile the dead by munching on their corpses before anybody had a chance to bury them, and they even killed each other on occasion. Those were the worst case scenarios. Most of the time, pigs were capable of being managed and herded in ways that made them collaborative and productive members of their agrarian communities, but the risks were still real, and farmers knew it. They were aware that keeping a pig had consequences for their farms and farming communities. It was possible to profit from a pig, but its embeddedness in material and social ecologies meant there would be costs. So to mitigate some of those costs, humans devised strategies to deal with these valuable but problematic animals. Spatial planning was one option. We actually see this at Goskes. The residents here channeled the movement of their livestock through a fenced trail that ran through the center of the village. And that was to lessen the opportunities for stray animals to damage the farming plots that are scattered throughout that area. But animals could thwart even very well plotted plans. And that's why it's so useful to read the legal material and the bioarchaeological evidence against each other. Because records like bones and charcoal and pollen can sometimes tell you how pigs fit into local agrarian ecologies, but the legal evidence can also indicate what the hiccups were, how different forms of agriculture didn't actually always fit together so neatly. And despite the differences between the post-imperial legal codes, most of them do share an interest in incorporating pigs into their political communities, or at least they knew that they ignored pigs at their peril. And unlike Roman laws, the early medieval codes from Gaul and Italy and Iberia in particular were keenly sensitive to the havoc that livestock, especially pigs, were capable of causing. So they made a few recommendations for how to avoid animal destruction in the first place. Obvious stuff like keep the fences fixed and the gates closed, but they were actually more interested in developing protocols for the aftermath to deal with the damages that pigs were inevitably going to cause despite those precautions. And usually the owners of pigs that escaped and caused damages owed fines to the injured party. In more destructive situations, a farmer was entitled to keep one pig from an invasive herd in addition to collecting the usual damages. But there were disagreements about where to draw the line here. So Burgundian lawmakers, for example, initially set a 3 strikes rule for pigs, where if your pigs traipsed through someone else's vineyards or meadows or grain or oak woods, you could receive up to 2 warnings to watch them properly. But if it happened a 3rd time, the farmer who suffered the losses could legally kill the best pig of the entire herd and keep the meat for himself. But apparently that policy struck some farmers and lawmakers as too lenient, because a later modification of this code added that the owner of a vineyard could kill 1 pig immediately if a herd of them were found in that painstakingly cultivated space. What was more consistent across early medieval legal cultures was that lawmakers never treated the damages that pigs did as an accident. The only extenuating circumstances that counted as real accidents, or really as real liabilities, or as non-actionable events, were rabies or demonic possession. So basically nobody was liable for the destruction an animal did if it was out of its mind. Otherwise, farmers did owe damages, and we don't know what animal owners felt about that definition of justice. It's not visible in the codes really, but it is clear that the farmers who found their investments destroyed by someone else's livestock thought that the laws didn't go far enough, because the law codes are full of instructions about what not to do if you find animals in your fields. Don't chase the animals off in a state of excessive rage and cause even more damage in the process. Don't send your dogs after them either. Don't cut the lips off livestock that are munching away, or an eye, or an ear, or a horn, or a tail. Don't kill them outright. And also, it had to be said that an aggrieved farmer shouldn't beat up or kill the animal's herder. These laws might surprise us that these things have to be said, but they remind us, obviously, that conflicts weren't always resolved according to legal protocol. Pigs caused problems that brought humans into conflict inside and outside the courts. And the Lombard king Rothari also alluded to the fact that incidents like pig biting and other animal-inflicted injuries weren't always put to rest after the requisite fines had been paid. even though that was precisely the point of having fines in the first place. So Rothari is trying to argue here that there was no point in instigating a cycle of violence in these cases because, as he puts it, a mute thing was the cause and there was no human intention involved. And if you're really fast at reading Latin, you can see the word that Rothari used for intention was studium, which obviously has the more general meaning of putting real effort into something. But if the fact that Rothari had to make this argument, he had to insist that a conflict wasn't legitimate if it hadn't originated in effortful human purposes, it's a sign that other people saw things differently. In this alternate view, which we can only get a hint of here, but a pretty good outline of it, farmers were holding each other personally accountable for their animals' actions. They expected animal behaviors to be legible enough to take the necessary precautions and measures. And when that collaboration broke down, it was fair for the injured party to retaliate. Focusing on human intentions like Rothari wanted to do had the effect of overlooking the other minds and relationships that made a farm work. So I've been arguing that the codes show there were conflicting views within and between legal communities about what was possible or reasonable to do when pigs or other livestock escaped. But the codes also complement the archaeological evidence we've got by showing that pigs not only fed into early medieval agriculture and economy and diet, they were also making a dent, however modest, in early medieval legal culture. Pigs were one of the prompts for lawmakers who, as other historians have already pointed out, were already thinking about the relationship between large and local political communities. They're prompting lawmakers to focus on the minutiae that mattered. There were lots of other domains in which pigs shaped humans' experiences and ethics, but in the time that's left, I want to move from farms and laws to a bigger picture of pigs, because early medieval commentators saw that human lives were not only constrained by their animals, but also illuminated by them. So in theory, according to Christian intellectuals who'd made a point in these centuries of thinking about creation, anything in the universe had the potential to provide a new view of the whole. Because God had created the world, and because his creation had a unitary coherence to it, any small part of it could help illuminate the entire architecture. And they figured that the intellectually responsible thing to do, as a person who wanted to learn more about the world and about God, was to shift your perspective back and forth between scales, between the spatial scales of large and small, between the temporal scales of past and present, and between the epistemological scales of the physical and the spiritual. And one of the richest sources for these pretty adventurous exercises is the hexameral literature of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. But it was never strictly confined to the pages of exegesis. And in part, that's evident in these exegetical texts themselves. So, you know, the hexameral commentaries by Basil of Caesarea and Ambrose of Milan, for example, they were structured as sermons for their congregations. And their audiences were definitely paying attention. So, for example, during one of Basil's sermons, members of his congregation started making hand signals to remind him while he was in the middle of speaking that he'd forgotten to talk about birds. He promised it earlier. He sort of skipped over it unthinkingly. They made him stop and go back. They didn't want him to skip such a beloved subject. And Basil was glad for the reminder because for him and for many Christians who were inspired by his work, to think big, you had to start small. It was worth thinking about maggots, for example, because they could illuminate whether God had designed them to come to life out of the body when it decayed, or whether they were already physically present in creation before anything had ever actually died. Or paying attention to the fact that it was harder to breathe at higher altitudes might help delineate the boundary between the lower and upper air, and then by extension to figure out where the fallen angels were located. The exegetes didn't think that the Bible actually offered firm answers to these questions. Instead, they suggested that their readers look to complementary and contemporary forms of expertise. So Ambrose recommended speaking with farmers about the birds they knew, and to fishermen about what lived in the sea. This would help them decode the complexity and order that God had woven into his creations. In the 7th century, Augustinus Hibernicus spoke to old men about their memories of the sea. And Augustine of Hippo himself had spent long hours by the fish fountain in Bulla Regia. He liked to observe how the fish anticipated being fed by passersby, which led him to conclude that fish had memories. In early medieval history, or in early medieval culture, natural history and cosmology were intertwined by virtue of the common denominator of their divine origins. So almost counterintuitively, the connections that bound the universe together could be reconstructed and analyzed by concentrating on the details of everyday experiences. So in that context, pigs were a lesson in miniature. When they drew humans' attention to the ways that an animal could affect a farm and the farms around it and the whole concept of public order, they offered an opportunity to examine how those ecologies were exactly linked. And I want to dwell on this conviction because in some ways, Christian intellectuals recognized that it was a really dizzying thing to suggest that the early medieval farm was materially and conceptually connected to the Christian cosmos. And I'll turn to Isidore again, this time his De Natura Rerum, which makes a wide-ranging and critical exploration of a universe in motion. Isidore was fascinated by a cosmos in which so many fluctuating systems overlapped with each other. And the later generations who read him reinforced this multivariable model visually by including diagrams of select systems in his cosmology. Most of these diagrams were represented as cosmic wheels or spheres in later manuscripts because the shape evoked the universe and time simultaneously. Some manuscripts also plant a human head at the center of these spheres, and that was a way of pointing the idea that there was symmetry between the macrocosmic and the microcosmic. This particular diagram from a Carolingian manuscript overlays the properties of hot, cold, dry, and wet, which are represented in the outer ring, and then shows them as they're instantiated in the 4 seasons, the 4 elements, and the 4 humors, and they appear in the cross that transects the sphere. Or in the same codex, there's another sphere it encompasses the 5 circles of the earth and indicates each zone's corresponding temperatures and habitability, while also noting their relationships to the ecliptic. Each of the visual diagrams represents a kind of ecology like this by encoding multiple parameters into a single visual system. And medieval readers were inspired by these images to give Isidore's book the alternate title of Liber Rotarum. And Isidore probably would have liked that a lot because he was convinced that to really understand the world, or even individual pieces within it, you had to consider all its interlocking systems simultaneously, from its elemental building blocks to its stellar circuits. If you were a careful reader of Isidore, even before this manuscript was illuminated, you might be able to visualize similar wheels in Isidore's writing, even without an artist's help, because he's aggregating so much information in a careful way. But the painted wheels magnify the multi-layeredness of his vision as the successive images of spheres and their human centers stack up into an increasingly complex cosmos. And this text and its manuscript tradition are a PowerPoint-friendly way to illustrate something that was more broadly true in the early medieval West, which was that this was a world in which the stuff that happened on the ground pointed to the world of the heavens. And although the links between all the dimensions of these worlds were hard to pin down, early medieval thinkers were not discouraged by the prospect. It was still worth trying to make predictions. Exegete after exegete enthusiastically recommended to their readers that they get out into the world to observe its diversity. So they figured that even though animals were surprisingly variable and complex, taxonomies were still worth sketching and refining. Even if countless forces were in play to make it rain or shine, you could still try to identify the most significant factors. Even if the system was complicated, there was still systematicity. And the more you learned about the physical world, the closer you got to understanding its spiritual side, to understanding the divine logic that made the world move. And so even pigs helped Christian commentators dig deeper. In Ireland in the 7th century, Augustinus Hibernicus had a kind of reverse Galapagos moment. Instead of looking on his island and noticing how different it was from everywhere else, he was struck by the animals it shared in common with other places. The wild animals of Ireland, including its pigs, were not unique. And he wondered how that was possible. He thought it was unlikely that humans had managed to transport wolves and wild boars and other untamed animals from the continent. And he thought that a more satisfying answer lay in the deeper history of hydrology. He reasoned that Ireland must have been connected to the continent at some point, so that animal species crisscrossed a common landmass before becoming separated by rising waters that eventually became the Channel and the Irish Sea. Augustinus went on to interview old men who confirmed that sea levels had even risen in their lifetimes. So he was reluctant to suppose that it had been the biblical flood that cut off Ireland and its pigs from the continent and its pigs. But when Ireland actually became an island was too hard to say at that moment. There were still too many hydraulic details to sort out. Augustinus said with a kind of mix of exasperation and reverence that we hardly know a fraction of the things we have. Incidentally, we still don't know how wild boar reached Ireland since they weren't present on the island until the early Holocene. Or to take another example, this one from Walafrid Strabo, who made a similar move and looked to pigs' behaviors to make sense of a bigger picture. So Walafrid reports in the Vita Galli that a miracle had been performed by the dead patron saint of the monastery of St. Gall. He sets the scene by telling us that it had been an unusually barren autumn. Even wild animals were having a hard time finding food, and the monastery's large herd of pigs couldn't rely on the usual crop of acorns for the fall fattening. But then, miraculously, St. Gallus appeared and led the pigs to a secret cache deep in the woods. Walafrid didn't have to tell his readers why all of this was weird, but today the story needs some explaining because we've lost the common knowledge that came from living closely with these animals. Pigs are not easy animals to herd, and they weren't back then. And so the slaves or dependents who worked as swineherds were more highly valued than other farm workers. But even the swineherd in Walafrid's story is baffled by the proceedings. His pigs had become illegible to him. They'd bolted with no apparent provocation. He'd had to track them down to a place that was more remote than any pasture he'd ever been to. And he wasn't sure how they were going to get home. So Gallus appeared to him in a dream, and he told him to give the head sow a good smack. She'd know where to go. And it worked. The fat pigs returned to the monks in an orderly formation. And that story might seem like a hagiographical snapshot of everyday life, but Walafrid told it because almost none of it was typical. And he was able to recognize it as a miracle thanks to the swineherds and the monks' careful attention to woodland ecology and to pigs' normal behaviors. Thinking about the things from the vantage point of a pig was part of the work of clarifying the cosmos and recognizing a divine message when you got one. So both Walafrid and Augustinus were scanning their landscapes for changes and abnormalities and interconnections and trying to evaluate their significance. They might have said that pigs had destinies in the general sense that all of creation had been set in motion at the start of the world, but they would have also pointed out that a pig's life had many possible trajectories that intersected with other equally complicated and fluctuating forces. It was only a testimony to God's capacious design that it was hard to keep the small things and the big things in mind all at once. And I'm not saying that pigs were seen as the key to the universe in these centuries. Anyone contemplating the cosmos was inherently interested in lots of different organisms and phenomena. But for many people in the early Middle Ages, the pig in particular helps them toggle pretty nimbly between vastly different scales of thinking. It wasn't only the naturalists and theologians who appreciated this. Farmers and policymakers had also found themselves forced to notice that thanks to their pigs, they were dealing with interlocking, fluctuating, and variable resources that required a correspondingly flexible approach to handling them. And that's in part, that sort of inspiration in looking at the pig was due in part to them being excellent models of resource salvaging because they had adaptive behaviors and diets. It was also because their penchant for exploring and escaping made it obvious that crops and neighbors and even legal communities were contingent on pigs, if only a little bit. And humans couldn't help but notice also that domestication did not fully transform pigs into commodities. They made trade-offs in order to keep raising and eating them, whether that meant spending more on fencing or labor or fines or social capital, or whether it meant restructuring communities and ethics in order to accommodate them. And this alertness to pigs' capabilities was finessed in cultures that were accustomed to precisely this analytical posture. Pigs were good to think with in societies that were invested in the politics and metaphysics of the big and the small, but they were good to think with because they were hard to work with and because they nimbly maneuvered what were highly differentiated terrains that they encountered on the ground. Pig history isn't just one among many expressions of the early medieval interest in switching between the universal and the particular. It's also a reminder that what happens on the ground can change the aerial perspective. The world that pigs helped us see and helped early medieval communities see ran wide and deep from the mud to the cosmos, and that view would be very different without them. It's just one more reason that it's worth making today's big histories maybe a bit more pre-modern. Thank you.